I'd now like to hand over to Professor Tiwari to take forward the discussion. Professor.
Thank you. So, before I invite our distinguished panelists to talk about this very important topic of what is the future of a sustainable mobility, I'd like to just point out few things, and maybe all of you can think about and address in your opening remarks also. I think there seems to be consensus that sustainable mobility is multidimensional. It is not just about cleaning fuel. It's not just about energy efficiency. Today, if we look at SDG goals, 17 goals, 7 of them directly are related to mobility. And 5 targets and 7 targets are indirectly related to mobility. So of course, energy efficiency is extremely important. But if you look at few other targets and goals, they talk about goal number 3.6. We have to halve the number of deaths that happens because of road crashes. Then we have 11.2. 11.2 talks about providing equitable access to all. And this is especially important in our context, in Asian and African context. So we have to think about this multi-dimensional sustainability. I think most of you must have read the little background note that was there for this session. And a few success stories were mentioned in that. So when I actually started reading it carefully, I noticed that the current success stories, which we call as car-free zones or introduction of EV in a substantial way, or focus on improving bicycling in UK, all these come from countries where the per capita income is at least more than 30,000 USD. And most of the world that we are talking about, where we are going to see motorization in future, in India, our current per capita income is only 1,600 USD. Brazil is much better, 8,000 USD. And in a very optimistic growth scenario, India would be little less than 12 to 15,000 in 2040. So we have to keep that in mind when we start talking about future mobility. Yes, many of us get very concerned that we get stuck in car congestion in Delhi. But if you just look at the numbers which have been put out by a census, 20% people in Delhi don't have to travel for work because they live so close to work. Or they have to live so close to work because they have no other option to travel. 15% trips are on bicycling, and earlier we were discussing that how unsafe you feel bicycling in Delhi. So many Asian countries and African countries where car users are in minority at present, I think in future our challenge is how to retain and have a choice, by choice people bicycling and walking, not just because they have no choices. I think some good examples, some success examples that are mentioned in the background note talk about how China has introduced BRT in a large way, but we also know at the same time car ownership and car sales continue to grow in China. So I'm not sure whether that has really done any dent to that. And we have also mentioned Ahmedabad BRT, which has but it has not resulted in more people using buses in Ahmedabad or more people cycling. So I think they still have a lot of challenge for countries who are already motorized and also for countries who are still motorizing. So with that, I think I would like to invite my panelists now, and we can go in the order that it was listed. So I think I had Tony's name first. Would you like to make your initial remarks? Thank you. You want to go there?
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Professor Tiwari. And I decided to use the one of the most sustainable forms of transportation, which is my own 2 feet, to travel over here to make the remarks. It's a great pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the warm welcome and all of the wonderful and warm people that I've met since I've been here, and all of the great food. I think I'll be taking some of the India carbon back with me to California. So just a couple of quick words about ClimateWorks. We're a global philanthropic organization that is dedicated to helping to address the climate crisis and ensure a prosperous future. And we really do take both those parts of our mission very seriously. We think that you can't address climate change unless you have a prosperous future, and you can't have a prosperous future unless you address climate change. I direct the transportation program at ClimateWorks, and I would agree wholeheartedly with the professor that this is really about addressing the future of the transportation system in a holistic and systematic way. We look at the opportunities to improve the efficiency of everything that moves, to move those things towards cleaner forms of energy, including clean electricity, as well as promoting sustainable cities that give people mobility choice, including transit, biking, and walking, all of which we think are essential to a future system that is safe for the climate. I will be focusing the bulk of my comments today on the opportunity to shift towards cleaner forms of energy, particularly clean electricity. And we see this as an essential element, and again, not just for cars, but for 2- and 3-wheelers, for buses, and for trucks. And again, not just to address climate change, but to ensure that we can have an affordable, accessible, and sustainable transportation system for a growing global population. I think the professor addressed this, but it's I think worth reinforcing that a efficient transportation system is really essential to a modern, prosperous society. It provides us a means to get to work, to see friends and family, to efficiently move goods, and to catalyze economic activity. But it also does come, at least the system that we have today, with a tremendous societal cost, and that includes emissions that contribute to climate change, volatile oil prices that contribute to economic and energy security, as well as air pollution that threatens the health of millions. So I've been working in the space of sustainable transportation for about 2 decades, and I have to say that for most of this time, it's actually been rather dull. Really, since the days of Henry Ford and John Rockefeller, we've more or less had the same transportation system that is powered by combustion vehicles and oil-based fuels. But really now, for the first time, certainly in my career, we're starting to see the potential, I want to emphasize that word, for a new paradigm and new technologies that have the potential to upend that 100-year monopoly. And this has been coupled with a growing global call to action, which we've been able to help support through philanthropy. I'm going to give just a couple of quick examples of this activity, and I look forward to the conversations. So over 30 major companies, including some here in India, Wipro, State Bank of India, IKEA, Hewlett-Packard, Baidu, DHL, have committed to shift 100% of their operational vehicles to electric by 2030 or sooner. And this is a program, and also to facilitate adoption by their customers and employees. And this is a program that was launched in partnership with the We Mean Business Coalition and is being led by my co-panelists organization, the Climate Group. I think he'll give some more details on that. In addition, over 24 cities around the world have signed on to a declaration facilitated through C40, including Los Angeles, from my home state, Mexico City, Milan, Paris, Quito, to shift 100% of their bus fleet, so their public transit operations, to clean fuels, clean electricity specifically, by or before 2025, and perhaps more ambitiously, to shift a major portion of their city to be emissions-free across all modes by 2030. And the only way to do that is to really take that systematic approach across all different modes of mobility. Separate from this initiative, we've seen significant success. Cities like Shenzhen, China, have shown a rapid uptake in clean buses. They have 100% of their fleet has been converted, 16,000 electric buses, and over 90% of their taxi fleet has been moved to vehicles that don't emit emissions. And over a dozen jurisdictions are part of a platform called the International Zero Emission Vehicle Alliance that includes California, Germany, UK, Norway, and others that have committed to all vehicle sales to be zero emissions by mid-century. And then just last year during the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco, we help support a new initiative called the Global Commercial Drive to Zero that aims to do the same for logistics and commercial vehicles by 2040. So these programs are already paying dividends. The industry has already announced over $300 billion in global private sector investment in electric transport, and the market, while nascent, is growing quickly with the greatest success in those regions that provide significant policy support. The prize for success is enormous. By our calculations, the introduction of this new, basically technology, transportation electrification, coupled with greater efficiency and efficient city design, can contribute to more than an 80% reduction in the emissions that contribute to climate change, and help address the air quality challenge, and offer hundreds of billions of dollars of savings in the form of fuel savings and reduced operational costs. Finally, this future is not guaranteed, and there are real barriers that exist to success. Fortunately, from what I can tell, based on my conversations here in India, that you have all of the ingredients here for success: ingenuity, technical prowess, a willing to experiment and to take risks, all of which are going to be necessary, and there is going to be bumps along the way. I remember when I first started working 20 years ago on this, this notion of the idea that we could shift towards a transportation system that didn't emit seemed quite fanciful. Some suggested that it was even impossible. Increasingly, I'm finding folks who say, well, this is inevitable. Look at all this investment, this is going to happen. And I will say, based on everything that we've seen, it's neither. It's neither impossible, it's not inevitable, but we think it is achievable if we work together. So thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Tony. I'd like to invite Roland now.
Good afternoon. My name is Roland Wong. I'm the Managing Director for the Climate and Clean Energy Program for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I would like to thank Professor Tiwari. I'd like to thank TERI for hosting this event and inviting me here. My first time to India, and enjoying it greatly and learning a tremendous amount. For those who may not know the Natural Resources Defense Council, hopefully you know we're an environmental NGO. We've been around for almost 50 years now. It's almost half a century NRDC has been around. And of course, we've been here in India for a little over 10 years actually. And my president, Ria Su, spoke this morning. My colleague, Jake Schmidt, was on this stage as well yesterday. And also my colleague, Andy Nodhoff from the San Francisco office was here talking about oceans just very recently. So I'm based in San Francisco, I'm based in California. I spent almost all my life in California. So I'm gonna put my foot firmly into the optimist camp, that we can achieve our goals to clean the air and decarbonize the economies globally. I grew up in California, mostly in the Bay Area, sometimes in Los Angeles. And during the 1970s, we had really bad air. I remember multiple times, many times, where as a 6 or 8 year old, a 10-year-old growing up, you're sitting in a classroom, you want to get out there and play and go to recess, but you have this thing called a stage 1 smog alert. And a stage 1 smog alert is about the level which we're seeing today here in Delhi. It's about that high 100s, that 200 kind of level, right? So in California, Los Angeles, in the Bay Area, we had really terrible air. Over 200 days in the 70s a year with stage 1 smog alerts. Today, fast forward to today, my sons, my kids, they don't know what a stage 1 smog alert is because we've been able to clean up the air. And a large part of that is cleaning up the air is through cleaner transportation. When Congress passed the law in 1970, something we call the Clean Air Act, they did not know. They told the state of California, they told other states, you have to meet clean air standards, you have to clean up the air. But to be honest, we didn't know how to do that in 1970. The 3-way catalytic converter was not invented, right? But because we put the law in place, we put the regulations in place, we drove regulations, drove innovation, drove investments, and what we got was much, much cleaner air. And to be clear, the air in Los Angeles, the air in the Bay Area is not healthy. but it's not, we don't have those extremely unhealthy air days before. More progress needs to be made. The good news today, when we're talking about cleaning up the air, whether it's the United States or in India or in China, the good news is that we know the solutions. We know many of the solutions. We know many of the policies that work because they've worked at various times in various places. We did a study called America's Clean Energy Frontier. We did this study recently. And what we did, we looked at pathways to clean development across the US economy. And what we found is that through 3 critical strategies, you can get 90% of the way to a clean, decarbonized economy. And that's energy efficiency, that's renewable electricity, and that's electrification of buildings, factories, and transportation. Those are the 3 critical strategies, and when we focus on those, we create a lot of leverage. For the transport sector, what does that mean for the US transport sector? Clearly, one of the jobs we have not done very well in the United States is reduce our auto dependency, reduce the amount of vehicle miles driven. When gasoline prices were high not so long ago, people started going to alternative transportation. Economy is now strong, oil prices are low, we're seeing increased driving again. So we need to do better on that again, but we know the solutions. Fund public transit. Infill development, transit-oriented development, mixed-use development. That's the future, and that's what's happening already in many of our cities. New mobility options. We have lots of new innovation happening. Almost as Anthony was saying, this is the most innovative time we've seen in the history of transportation for almost for a century. Right? We got to capture that and harness that for the good of the environment, for the good of the public, create safer, more accessible, more equitable transportation systems. Is there an opportunity there? The opportunity is not going to transpire without clear public policies. So what does that mean for countries like India and other countries that have so far not followed the path of automobile dependency as the United States? The challenge here, and not an easy challenge, is to look toward countries where they've had success and where things might apply to countries like India, but of course not repeat some of the mistakes that the United States has gone down. India, motor vehicle adoption rate here is about 20 per 1,000. In the United States, it's about 1 to 1. It's about 900 per 1,000 people. In China, it's about 170. It's hard to imagine the whole world, it's hard to imagine India, it's hard to imagine the whole world going down that same pathway of adoption of the personal automobile and us being able to avert a climate catastrophe and be able to clean up and have healthy air in some of these mega cities and have a safe, accessible, affordable transportation. So we have to avoid that. So first and foremost, new, clean, sustainable transportation options. And that, again, and those, we know the solutions: fund transit, development, mixed use, transit-oriented development, infill development, compact development. All these things make a lot of sense, and I know this is happening in many parts of the world, including India as well. Discourage the use of the personal automobile. Congestion pricing, high parking pricing, low emission or zero emission zones. These are going to be very, very effective tools. And of course, try to harness that innovation. We know that billions of dollars are going into innovation into the transportation space. It's a ripe space for innovation. It's a ripe space for private investment. It's a huge problem with a huge opportunity. But it's not going to happen in the pace and in the manner which those in the environmental community, those who want to help clean up the air and move towards a sustainable environment, it's not going to happen without some powerful intervention by leaders, by government leaders. So that's the challenge ahead of us. So I'm quite optimistic. The challenges are great. In the US, the transportation system is now the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. It exceeded the power sector for the last 3 years running. The power sector in the US is decarbonizing with renewable energy, with natural gas replacing coal, it's decarbonizing. Transportation going in the wrong direction. But again, I'm optimistic because we know the solutions. And we also know the scale of the urgency of the problem. And we also know that urgency combined with leadership can create tremendous opportunity for private sector, for public sector, for NGO, for public interest sector, all to work together to find the right solutions and accelerate that clean energy, that sustainable, affordable, accessible transportation system that is really going to be needed. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Ambassador André do Lago now.
Well, first I want to thank TERI for inviting me today. I have to explain I'm not here as so much as Brazilian ambassador, but more because I've worked many years in my life with energy, sustainable development, and climate change. And I'm also architecture and city critic, so I have a parallel life to my new life in Delhi. Professor Tiwari, I thank you for your introduction. And one thing that I totally agree with you is that countries like India and Brazil, as developing countries, and with very different conditions according to the city or according to the region, have to examine all kinds of options that are presented to it. Obviously, Brazil, the scale is much smaller than India, but anyway, I think we have some experiences that I would love to share with you. So I think that the first thing as a developing country is that we have to afford it. So there are many solutions that are presented today, and we have a growing middle class that has some aspirations. I think it's quite interesting to mention to you that in 2013 there was a series of protests in Brazil, mostly of the middle class, after a significant raise of the number of middle class people in Brazil. And in those protests that brought millions of people to the street and that surprised everybody because it was people that had their life much better than recent years, one of the signs of the protest that I think was most interesting was that they said advanced countries are not the ones in which the poor can have a car. An advanced country is where the rich use public transportation. So this is a moment in which we are arriving, and as was mentioned before, we can leapfrog, we can avoid some mistakes that were made in other countries. But there is still a stigma in the public transportation in all of our countries naturally, and we have to try to fight that. The other thing that you mentioned that I think is very important is how mobility is central for the SDGs. But there is one thing of the SDGs that I would like to stress that I believe is also very clear that we have to deal with, which are the unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. We have a model of middle class, a model of life that cannot be used by everybody. But naturally, as a developing country, India and Brazil have always defended that obviously it's the developed countries that have to first change their unsustainable patterns and create new patterns. But the good news, and I'm an optimist too, is that we have answers. We have answers. I think we have advanced enormously in the political dimension of this issue. We have advanced, I think, also very much in the scientific knowledge and also, I think, in the innovation capacity. But there are two issues that we have to deal with. One is how to make it economically attractive. For three dimensions. It has to be economically attractive for business, it has to be economically attractive for governments, but it has to be obviously attractive to the people. People should not think that they are going to be condemned to not being able to have what some others can have. So I want to insist a bit about this issue of the SDGs, and I want to mention, and that's where I want to enter into a Brazilian dimension of that, is that we have two experiences in Brazil that have, I think, had a big impact and are still very debatable. But one is the BRT, the bus rapid transit, that started in Brazil in the 70s. And we also have our ethanol program in Brazil. The ethanol program in Brazil has been an extremely successful intent that started in 1975 by necessity. You know, the developing countries find solutions by necessity. So Brazil didn't have coal, so it had to develop hydro and other renewables. So in that point, we were quite lucky. And the same thing, we didn't have oil in 1973. So we had to have our cars moving, and we developed the ethanol engine. I'm not going to get into details about how this has evolved, but the fact is that now, today, 90% of Brazilian cars are produced in the flex fuel mode. Flex fuel mode is a car that can use as much ethanol and as much gasoline as you want. So, depending on the fluctuation of the price of oil, you put only ethanol, or you can put the gasoline, which in Brazil is mixed by ethanol, with ethanol, by 27.5%. So there is all a myth about 3% or 10% or whatever. And the good news is that we have a long experience in using more than 25% ethanol in gasoline, and even imported cars, the kit to adapt them to this kind of fuel costs 50 euros. So the big problem of ethanol is that it is subversive, and the production comes from developing countries. But India, that now is the biggest producer in the world of sugarcane, can have a much more expanded experience with ethanol, and the Brazilian government, the Brazilian and the Indian government are working hard to make it a reality, because the experience was really very impressive. We can, if you have questions, I can go into that. The other thing is the bus rapid transit, as I mentioned. The bus rapid transit, in average, costs 80 times less than metros, than underground. So it is, again, a solution of necessity that started in Curitiba because they didn't have a budget to do the metro. And the then mayor, brilliant urbanist Jaime Lerner, developed the BRT. And it's wonderful that the BRT now is in 30 countries. But I have to say to you that the BRT took a long time to be used in other cities in Brazil because, again, I want to tell you, as I mentioned, the economic interests surrounding it, the political interests surrounding it. Now my city, for instance, Rio, has a splendid BRT, but we have to put so many things together, but we have the answers. We have definitely to work together and use these answers for making sure that the world population has adequate, sustainable transportation. The last word is about energy. We in Brazil, we are very much interested in electric cars. And one of the reasons is that we have a very clean electric matrix. We have almost, 90% of our electricity is sustainable, is renewable. So, because an electric car, when you are using coal, is not exactly the answer. So we have to work together and find intelligent answers in front of all the options that we have in front of us. But most of all, I think we have to change our unsustainable patterns of production and consumption and make things affordable for everyone. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Tim Ashby now.
Thank you, Professor Tiwari. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Ashby. I'm a director at the Climate Group based in London, but we're an international NGO with representation here in Delhi, in Beijing, New York, and also in, thank you, also in Brussels. I wanted to speak in particular around the role that we see around electric vehicles, acknowledging the challenge around sustainable mobility as being the bigger challenge, but I also wanted to focus in on the particular issues around electric vehicles, because we see the electric vehicles as being the vital tool in the clean energy transition, which is ultimately our goal as an organisation. And I want to talk about two components of that. The work that we do with governments, and in particular with subnational governments. The unit of government there that I'm talking around is state government in the Indian context, or provincial government in China, or similar such levels of governance, and also our work with businesses. Now, we see a shifting paradigm with the transition to electric vehicles around the world, offering a potential to reduce air pollution and tackle climate change. Over 5 million vehicles are now on the road worldwide, 2 million added last year, with EV sales and market share growing rapidly. There were virtually no electric vehicles on America's roads in 2009. Now there are more than 1 million. And the top 5 months for sales were the last 5 consecutive months of 2018. In the Climate Group, we see one of the big opportunities is the conversion of business and government fleets to electric vehicles. And that also picks up the opportunity for more sustainable transport, particularly bus rapid transport, because after all, it's government that implements some of the key bus transport routes, for example, school buses here in India being an extremely important one. For commercial vehicles, talking about last mile delivery. And in the UK, over half of the vehicles on the road are registered to companies. And in the US, 3 million cars and light trucks will be sold to commercial and government fleets this year. That's roughly, very nearly 20% of all US automobile projected sales in 2019. So we work with businesses that are seeing the benefits and making the changes. Companies see electric mobility as a key part of their leadership responsibility with regard to climate change, as well as to air pollution. Companies using AVs save on fuel, maintenance and repairs. We believe that the business case is there already, and switching to EVs helps companies to lower the risk by avoiding additional future costs. More than 24 cities worldwide have already committed to establish low emission zones by 2030. It's important that businesses think ahead of the curve on that. And Anthony referred earlier to the Climate Group's EV100 initiative, which brings together companies committed to accelerating the transition to EVs and making electric transport the new normal by 2030. EV100, which is our program, now involves 31 companies across 66 markets worldwide, pledging to make 2 million vehicles net zero of emissions by 2030. By joining EV100, businesses are increasing demand, moving markets, driving mass rollout, and making electric cars more rapidly affordable for everyone. With regard to our work with state, regional and national governments, we also see a big step up. More than a dozen countries worldwide have pledged to end the sale of combustion engine vehicles by 2040 or before, and over half of them are targeting 2030 or sooner, including Denmark, Ireland, Norway, the Netherlands and Costa Rica. And through our role at the Climate Group as the Secretariat of the Under 2 Coalition, a group of states and regions committed to climate action, we're witnessing momentum building at state and provincial level on EVs as well. Through the coalition, more than 50 governments have worked together on policies to increase the number increase the shift to ZEVs on their roads, zero emission vehicles. So right here in India, we're also seeing changes towards a shift towards electric vehicles. There's a recognition of the benefit for people's health, for their jobs, and for the environment. Large Indian businesses such as the State Bank of India, Wipro, are already leading the way as members of EV100, committing to 100% electric vehicles for their commercial fleets by 2030. And states in India, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, and others have signed MOUs with the EESL to lease EVs and install charging infrastructure into government offices. Through the Future Fund that we operate as part of the Under 2 Coalition, we've supported the state of West Bengal to update its climate action plan to include electric vehicles. And Niti Aayog, the National Institute for Transforming India, has welcomed the EV100 initiative, recognizing the potential that EVs have in driving the Indian economy and generating quality jobs in the country. So globally, things are moving quickly. But it needs to happen even faster to achieve emissions reductions. The share of electric vehicles in global sales is still small, under 2% in most regions. So actions are required at all levels to fast forward this transition. Companies need to support policymakers at all levels to switch to electric transport. National governments must provide clear direction by setting phase-out dates and stringent emission standards. And subnational state governments can step in and provide strong leadership and demonstrate what is possible at the subnational level. All the leadership that we're seeing will send a clear market to the automotive companies to step up their game and accelerate vehicle supply. Thank you.
So, well, we heard our panelist, and what I heard most of the time was talk about cars. I heard, we are talking about zero emission vehicles, which is very good. We should in future have zero emission vehicles. We also heard about business models that work for EVs. And you had a very nice mention of California and how it's been able to clean because many things are possible. And, but I do want to highlight before I open the floor for questions. So you talked about mixed land use patterns in TOD. Most Indian cities tend to have mixed land use patterns because of necessity, because people have no choices to do long travel. So even Delhi, the mixed land use pattern is very high, and that is why when we start looking at how people travel in, and this is true for not just for India, for most South Asian cities. So I think some of the so-called known solutions, we have to think hard that many known solutions have societal imprint, and how does it translate in another. So we can have your response to that also after questions from the floor. And I think one thing that I found very useful and important mentioned by you, we have to reduce consumption. There is no other way out. And this applies both to high-income countries, and you mentioned in your write-up how tough it is, because there is a lot of public resistance to reducing car use. And earlier I was discussing with you that even in countries where there are minorities using cars, but we have very powerful vocal minority. So I think the challenges for both, we have to address that. And last point that I would like to put to the floor also, switching from IC engines to EVs. Is there really
to what?
IC engines to electric vehicles? Is it really leapfrogging? Because to me, leapfrog should be something like reducing consumption. And what strategies do we have for that? And what about health? We have a lot of studies coming out which shows that we can have clean air because we can have clean fuel, etc. But lack of active transport. We, through evolutionary processes, human beings are designed for walking. And there are really good studies which have come out from Europe linking mental health, cerebrovascular diseases, just to walking. There is no other. Going to gym doesn't solve that problem. So I think, let me open the floor for questions.
Professor Tiwari, we've just got 4 minutes left. So
yes,
I
so
suggest
I'm stopping and I'm giving it to them.
Two very quick questions and then the responses. That would be lovely. Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Bangalore, 900 buses has been out of road. 10 depots has been closed down. The current government promising for last 3 years, 1,000 bus coming, 1,000 bus coming. Public transport is the only solution. My friend from California said they know the solution. We also know the solution, but there should be political will and bureaucratic will. Then it will be solved.
So would you like to respond? You did mention that how it has to be funded. Transit has to be funded.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, I don't have the solutions for every context, but I do think that it's very clear that public transit has been underfunded, and it's very clear in a country like the United States, we have unfortunately pulled back from funding transit. Now we're trying to put that transit. We're building light rail in the United States because we see the mistakes that has occurred. I would also just say and mention the fact that the pathway the United States undertook was a conscious decision by the government to build out highways and allow, in some cases actually allow a company like, there's a story about General Motors buying up light rail, tearing it up because they wanted to sell buses. So what I'm saying is that there was an intentionality associated with where we ended up because there was a thought that this was the best pathway for prosperity for the United States, right? Now, fast forward to 2019, we understand and realize that I don't think there's anybody who believes that the pathway to prosperity is to go along, have 900 cars per 1,000 people, or even 170 cars per 1,000 people, to continue to build out highways and continue to build out sprawl. So if, we now do understand that the better pathway is to think more intentionally about how we develop our communities and how we fund our transport system. I would mention also, we talk a lot about new mobility in companies like Uber and Lyft in the United States. Those are good innovations in reducing dependency on ownership, but it's not necessarily true that it's going to reduce driving and congestion, and that's exactly what's occurring. Without some sort of intentionality to policy. In New York, they're charging fees on that, on Ubers and Lyfts, and funding that to transit. In California, we're moving towards regulating the Ubers and Lyfts to have them control their emissions, probably by electrifying them.
Okay, do we have time for another question, or should we? Okay, one more question. We have time for one more question?
Yes,
okay.
please.
Okay, you got up first.
Thank you, Chair. My question is that greater emphasis of the discourse on sustainable mobility has been on moving people and minimizing air pollution and energy consumption. However, limited had been on how does that initiatives relating to mobility contribute on real estate values, which actually is a major source of funding such kind of infrastructure. So my question is to the panel, if there have been any thoughts or initiatives which formally address and capture this coming back to the exchequer. Thank you.
Does anybody want to answer that?
If I understood the relation between
real estate
real
value
estate
and
values.
funding.
Yeah. I think it's a very interesting question, and I believe there are many studies in that sense, and I think that all the new urbanism, the most advanced urbanism thinking takes this very much into consideration. For instance, that you should only build tall buildings near a metro station, for instance, and things like that. But I just want to comment that at the end of the day, in all that was discussed, the costs are the main issues. But in the case of India, there is an amazing, interesting thing, is the scale of India. With the scale of India, you can develop all kinds of things, and that is the very good news. In the beginning, when we started to find, look for solutions in other places, you never had the expectation of having so many hundreds of millions of people that you had to bring things. So I believe that India will bring many, many solutions to the rest of the world, thanks to the expectation of the scale and the expectation of growth.
Thank you. Tony had
Just-
a small.
Yeah, one very, very brief, which hopefully reinforces the other points, which is So when we look at all the potential solutions for sustainable mobility, there's really sort of three solution sets that include incentives, infrastructure, and information. And you can, on any dimension, you can sort of break it down into those. I just want to say one thing. On the infrastructure, it really is a lot about the allocation of public space. If you look at those places around the world that have the most sustainable transportation systems, Copenhagen, New York City, and others, they've allocated their public space to the modes that they think are the most sustainable. So biking, walking, and this is the most valuable resource that you have that is within all of your control. As a democracy, you can choose how you allocate that, and I think that's really where the biggest lever is.
Do we allow 30 seconds to Tim, if you want to make any last, because
Yeah,
everybody
I
else
think,
got
I think
some
that's
opportunity.
a fantastic point to finish on, because I think really you see the tyranny of the roads. I think a lot of the extension of road networks was based on fundamentally false economics, which was the failure to value the time that was lost in traffic and transport and the adverse social impacts of burgeoning traffic. And that built out a lot of the congestion problems that we've had in Western Europe, in North America, through the 80s and 90s. And it's taken an awful long time for that mindset around car ownership to unravel. So.
Thank you so much. Let me just finish with 30 seconds. So, last thing that I want to mention is, we started with the problem of congestion in Delhi. And in all the public documents, I find that we want to do various things to solve congestion problem. And if we solve congestion for cars, we can have good public transport. But if I have a car, I will use my car. It is more comfortable. So if we are looking for congestion problem, it means we want to promote car use. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.